Good evening, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. So today I will be presenting the findings from a research project that sought to understand how farm programs integrate children and childcare in their farm programming. Before I move forward, I'd like to introduce you to the team who worked on this project. And this team is myself, Florence Becot. I am at the National Farm Medicine Center, and I worked on this project with my colleague, Shoshanah Inwood from The Ohio State University, as well as Andrea Rissing from Arizona State University. So when it comes to injury preventions among farm children, we know that about 60% of agricultural-related injuries are sustained by non-working, bystanding children. And one of the key farm safety strategy has been to use childcare, which is essentially to supervise children of the work site by an adult, may it be paid or unpaid. Still, what we know from research is that farm parents continue to bring their children to the work site, even when they are aware of risks, and some folks have talked about the farm safety paradox. So in terms of why my parents should continue to bring their children to the work site, what we know from the existing literature has been, we know quite a bit about farm parents and farm children safety knowledge and behaviors. And there's also been work connected to cultural and social motivations around why parents might be bringing children to the work site. And this includes things such as traditions or needing or wanting to, for the children to learn about farming. What we know less about is childcare and agriculture and the extent to which farm parents might be using it. So yeah, at the same time, what we know is that there is evidence that farm women face challenges in taking care of their children and also experience a lack of support. So that really brings to light the need to understand childcare decisions, as well as the social systems that shape these decisions. What are the larger environments in which farm parents are making these decisions? So the project that I'll be talking about today is a part of a larger research project, which is looking at linking childcare to farm children safety. As a quick note, this was a project conceptualized pre-COVID-19, and COVID-19 has changed quite a few things connected to childcare. And it is also part of a research agenda exploring how policy-relevant farm household issues affect agriculture. So this is part of a 5-year mixed methods research project. And today what I'll talk about are just two components from the first year of the project: the document review of farm programs and resources, as well as key informant interviews with farm organizations and service providers. In terms of our research questions, we wanted to understand, how do farm service providers and farm organizations integrate topics connected to children and childcare into their programming? And farm service provider was broadly defined as any person who works in a capacity to provide services to farmers, may be direct or indirect. And so that does include extension services, research, that also includes state agencies of agriculture and farm organizations, or any member-based organizations that represent farmers. Our second research questions look at what are farm service providers and farm organizations' perspective on the interactions between children, farm business, and farm safety. And our third question was, what factors shape the integration of children and childcare topics in the programming? Really, overall, our goal was to understand the social systems in which farm families make decisions before we dive further into the research project and directly interact with farm parents. And we thought that farm programmings are important in the sense that they are an important source of resources in the life of farmers. Our study, both the design and the interpretations of the findings, are grounded in the Women in Agriculture literature, which is a pretty large rural social science body of literature that looks at farm women's conditions as well as their identities. And there is also a substrand of the literature that looks in particular at farm programs, how farm programs may be serving or not the needs of farm women. So in terms of our two-step approach, we first started with a document review. We conducted online searches between in November and December 2020. And essentially what we did is we had a series of search terms, which we used in conjunction with the geographical focus of the study. And then from there, from all of the search results that we identified, we then proceeded to coding them thematically, looking at the target population, focus of programs and resources, coverage of children, family, and childcare. And we looked at both the text as well as the pictures. So we did 2 rounds of codings and analysis on 92 search results. And originally we identified over 160, but with the duplicates, we ended up with 92. We then conducted CAM format interviews with 38 individuals in the spring and summer of 2021. Again, we continue to focus on our 3 study states, but also talk to a couple of national experts. We had 2 different interview guides. Was the one that was more targeted towards folks who focus on farm business aspects, and that's also the guide that we used with farm organizations. And then we had a guide focused on farm safety. We did 2 rounds of, we did coding by 2 team members, and we did a thematic analysis based on our research questions. One of the things that we were particularly interested in understanding was variations among respondents on the basis of gender, age, educational attainment, parental status, as well as farming background. So in terms of our finding, overall, what we found was that there was overall in about half of the documents that we reviewed, half of them did not make mentions of children or family aspects as well. And for childcare was 85% of those did not make any mention of childcare. And then about half of the resources made inconsequential mentions of children and family aspects. And those inconsequentials are those where there's just a mention, but there's not really any practical resources associated to it. So for example, a mention might be, that farmers are a great place to raise children, or when it connected to childcare, it might be a mention connected to using childcare, but without really connections to actual resources. So these findings both continue to stay similar when we did the CAM format interviews. And when we looked at which programs are more likely to integrate different aspects, we found that programs focused on farm safety and the folks that were interviewed were most likely to integrate children and childcare into their programming. Their work included recommendations and training targeted to farm parents, youth, and employers, and they covered topics connected to designing safe play areas, machinery operations, assignment and supervision of tasks. What we found, though, however, when it came to the coverage of childcare topics, while there was the general recommendation to use childcare, overall, we did not really find practical guidance on how to access. And that's something that we heard from folks that we talked to. They said they recommend that people use it, but they wouldn't really provide resources about it. When looking at the integration by farm programming, we found that they were least likely to integrate children and childcare in programming, and there were also variations based on the focus of the programs. What we found is that those focused on beginning farmers and farm management programs would not necessarily touch on it as a standalone topic, but they commonly wove it through their programming when they talk, for example, about goal setting, when they will make recommendation that when folks set goals for their farm, they incorporate the needs of the family. Women in agriculture and farm transition programs were least likely to touch on it. What was surprising, farm transition programs, for example, was not so surprising considering that most of the farmers that these programs tend to serve are the older generations. For women in agriculture, that one we were a bit puzzled as to why they didn't really talk about children. And we think that it might have something to do about professionalization of women in agriculture, which we'll talk about later. The last piece that I'll say as well is that some of the folks that we talked to talk about the importance of bursting the romanticized bubble of raising children on farms, in particular when it came to working with first-generation farmers who did not grow up on farms. So when we look at the integrations among farm programs, farm organizations, we found the widest variations among this group in terms of the coverage, and it was done through the lens of farm business, farm safety, as well as quality of life. For organizations where it was least integrated, what we heard from pretty much all of them was that They do serve farm families, but the thread of family issues was more, is woven through, but was not necessarily a focus. And also what we heard was that there was no explicit integration of children and childcare topics. Then there was another group that we can think of it as more middle of the road integration, where there's some explicit integration through blog posts, conversations, virtual support groups connected to parenting on farms. And what we found among this group was that the emphasis was on peer-to-peer sharing of stories, resources, as well as changing the narrative, as well as talking about the complexity, for example, of raising children on farm, which hasn't necessarily been talked about a whole lot. Most integration was among a couple of groups that talk about how they explicitly integrate children and childcare through their advocacy work and through coalition building with childcare advocacy groups. Those were organizations that were specifically calling out for policy and programmatic solutions. In terms of the perspectives on how do children interact with the farm business, what we heard from many of those key informants, I would say most of them, is that a clear perspective, a lot of discussions around how having children on the farm, as much as it's wonderful and desired by a lot of parents, it can also make things quite complicated with day-to-day impacts of slowing down work, of not being able to do certain tasks, with middle to long-term impacts as well as consequences on farm reproductions. To give you an example, on the middle to long-term impacts, one informant talked about how they knew about a farmer who had work to scale down the milking schedule to 1 time a day so that they could spend time because they had to look after, I think it was 5 children. When looking at the perspectives connected to farm safety, consistently folks talked about the frequency of children being into the dangerous work site. What was interesting too was how for some groups of informants, they talked about how parents were not aware of the dangers, and that tended to be more frequent among farm safety folks versus farm business folks and farm organizations. What we heard more was that they knew it was dangerous, but they don't really know what else to do. They felt that they lacked in alternatives. What we heard consistently too was how the balancing act of balancing work versus danger versus farm safety recommendations versus childcare options. And here we got into a lot of discussions around what does the rural childcare landscape look like and the extent to which farm parents are able to use it and pay for it. And so here, that's when we got into recommendations of farm safety recommendations that might not be practical and feasible. And what's interesting too is that talking to some farm safety folks, that they talked about being well aware that the recommendations that they were making, as informed by science as they were well aware that they were not always practical. And so for some, we could hear too some of the ethical dilemmas that were involved in their work. So the last theme that really came through the data that we didn't necessarily set out to ask about was the perspectives on the interactions between children and parents' well-being. We heard a lot about the stress of doing it all for parents. We heard about a lack of support for parents. We also heard about the worries or guilt of children getting hurt, as well as a disconnect between romanticized views and the realities. All this is very important. And it's something that we have actually continued to hear a lot about from women that we've talked to this year, is really the connections between taking care of the children and farm parents' well-being. And when we look at the farm safety literature, in particular focused on children, a lot of that literature tends to focus on the children, but really what it points to is also the importance of thinking about the well-being of farm parents, because we know the connections between stress as well as farm safety outcomes. The last piece that I talk about in terms of finding was that the factors shaping whether or not children and childcare are integrated into the programming. And I won't go through all of it, but what we found was essentially kind of this different side of the same fuzzy coin, where kind of like the opposite side. And so to give you a couple of examples, When we looked at how the people that we talked to conceptualize the agri-family system, on one hand, we talked to the folks that tended to not integrate the topic of children and childcare. What we found is they were more likely to talk about how the household and the business are separate entities, how they need to stand on their own, versus for the household issue versus for the other group that tended to integrate programming. What we heard was that for them, household issues or business issues, in the sense that if things are not going well in the household, they're most likely not going to go well on the business side of things. Lived realities and experiences also came up a whole lot, even if the integration was informal. We've heard about saying, I've been there. I've been in that boat, and we actually talked, I don't know the proportion, but quite a few of the farms, of the kin farmers that we talked to also operate a farm. And so there was, again, that lived realities. And then for some folks that we talked to, they admitted themselves that it wasn't on their radar as much. And there were some that talked about how they don't have children, or they had stay-at-home spouse that helped with taking care of the children while they're at work. So in terms of the summary of the findings, we have this key tension. On one hand, we have quite this acute awareness of the challenges associated with navigating the children, farm work, and keeping the children safe. But on the other hand, we have this little integration of children and childcare topics in programming. So what we heard from the informants is that there is a set of individual and structural level factors to explain the immediate integration, which is often the case. But really, we wanted to understand still, why is this tension there if we know there is a problem? And this is where we get 4 possible explanations from the women in agriculture that we don't necessarily want to say this is precisely what's happening, but they are a potential explanation of what is going on that warrant future research. So the first one is a difference between child work and farm work. So one of the things that the women in agriculture literature has talked a lot about, as well as the broader literature that talks about care work, is that how in society oftentimes work connected to the household and the children is not seen as work. It's reproductive work in the sense that it's unpaid, versus farm work it's paid, it's what makes money. And so that could be why children have been invisible from farm programming, potentially. We also find that oftentimes the primary goal of farm programming was to support the productive function of the family farm. And in other words, that potentially explain why folks were not necessarily talking about childcare work. Another thing that we saw a lot too was the alignment of farm programming with a traditional family farm model, where we have the parents, the children, as well as sometimes the older generation. We don't find a lot of room for different models of families where maybe we didn't find where really the emphasis in the programming was connected to having the children around. And so one of the questions that really come up, or one of the potential explanation in particular for the farm safety folks, was connected to some of the tension too, in terms of the pushback that they have received from the ag sector. And in particular, what came up a few times was the pushback that happened in the early years of the Obama administration, when there was a proposal to reform some of the ag labor laws, and there was a big pushback. And so that could be connected to that potentially. And last, there's a mismatch between farm programming scope, resources available, and childcare challenges, in the sense that we talked to folks that said, I see the problem, but I really don't know what to do. It's outside of my control. For example, the cost of childcare or lack of availability. So what are the implications potentially out of these findings? And they're really framed as questions because, again, our findings warrant more research to really understand what's going on. But one questions that really come up for us is, could the invisibility of children and childcare and farm programming as it is at the moment, could that deter farm parents from participations when their lived realities are not accounted for in farm programming? And in other words, if there isn't a model, I leave that there. There is also questions around our societal norms around gender, and division of care and farm work reproduced, in the sense that, again, what we found through the farm program document review, as well as through the key informant interviews, was often the discussion of, the children are on the farm, this is what's always done, but there were very little, a lot less discussions around people using childcare and how it's part of their day-to-day. And last, there are questions about, could there be counterproductive consequences of farm programming if it implicitly indicates limited acceptance and space for the use of farm childcare? And essentially what this means is, because so much of the framing of these programs and so much of what we found, what we saw and heard, was that essentially that gave credence to the idea that children should be on the farm. Does that mean that it's counterproductive in the sense that it's also not offering a different way of raising children in agriculture? So as far as recommendations, we have a few. And again, this is a qualitative study, and there's not, we can't claim that there is a need for future research, but based on our finding, what we find is the importance of staff with diversity of identities and lived experiences at all levels of organizations. And by that, we mean is that all the way up, the organization should have folks with the diversity of identities and lived experiences. Indeed, what we heard is some of the folks who had the most acute sense of what was going on were the county agents, the ones that are directly interacting with the farm parents on a day-to-day basis. And what we found in some cases is that the folks that were more in charge of program development felt more remote and said that they don't really know what was going on, not as much. One thing that could be done that maybe is the easiest to do is the provision of resources to use childcare use in farm safety and farm business programming. And so this could be information about where can people find childcare, what type of financial support might be available. And a lot of those resources are available already, that information, through departments of family services or extension services from family sciences, and the idea of collaborations. And so that brings us to the last point around the importance of multidimensional approaches to address structural factors at play. And it's the importance of collaborations between farm service providers as well as groups already working on childcare topics. And essentially, this is to say that there are already groups working in this space, but at the same time, what farm service providers do is really elevate the needs of farm populations connected to non-traditional work hours, connected to some of the challenges of limited social infrastructures in rural areas, because one of the things that has been talked about connected to childcare advocacy groups is they tend to be a lot more urban-centric. And last, there's also a role of farm organizations in advocating with policymakers to broaden the coverage of farm programming. Oftentimes, what we heard from the farm service programmers, farm service folks, is that it's not that they don't want to do this programming, it's that there's just no funding for it. It's not a mandate. And so in some ways, this is where farm organizations could advocate among policymakers for the importance of making space for different types of programs that will consider household level needs when it comes to childcare and the children. So in case you're interested in hearing more, we have a couple of articles. One article was published recently in a journal, and we also have a shorter outreach-oriented piece that was published at Purdue University Institute for Family Business. And thank you again for tuning in. I just have some thank yous, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions.